theoretical and abstract way before we talk about the more. I want to give everyone an opportunity to just kind of take a couple minutes to think about that. And maybe if you're having trouble imagining what that might look like, thinking about the pot of nasturtium seeds that we all planted at the beginning of this quarter and where they might be in their germination process and how big their roots are and how they might be getting their nutrients and stabilization. So if everyone wants to just get comfortable, myself included, I'll give you a little signal when time's up. Their strength and stabilization and nutrients in whatever form that takes for you. If you'd like to share that, I'd love to hear. Also feel free to spend some time writing about it. That's how you'd like to express it.
What makes you feel like you have roots? From that, I think the word that came to mind was grounded. What makes me feel like I'm
power in that metaphor, and I feel there's importance in thinking about that before just going into the more factual side of it. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Yeah.
I feel like I have roots within spring water. Just what came to me as I was laying there thinking is like I could feel my heartbeat and I could hear Jordan breathing and I could feel Jordan. Oh, I'm surrounded by Jordans. I could feel Jaybert's like presence, and I was just thinking like our bodies run on electricity, and maybe that's where some of the energy that I feel comes from. Our body's creating this energy, and then it's coming into me and then into the group.
Project, I have a strong connection, and my ideas in many forms of like thinking about metaphor in terms of roots got really lost in that, because it's kind of just this abstract thing, just as like most of us and most of the time roots are just buried underground, and like there's just this vastness and unknownness of these networks and communities and things that are like supporting and stabilizing these organisms that we interact with in a more physical way. And I think there's a lot of power in that, and there's a lot of, like I said, metaphor. And so just exploring that, and also just kind of learning more about how the physiology of roots work and how different it is, and just kind of letting myself be overwhelmed with that there are thousands and thousands of plants, and like they all have a similar root system and structure, but it's all different. And so as I say that, I clearly can't encompass all plants in this presentation and all the individuality and importance of the different root structures, but it all exists, and there's no way of knowing or encompassing that. So the next part is the that the word isn't even on there, but I have too many notes on my paper. But yeah, so the root, the way that the root uptakes water mostly is from the root hairs and the root cap. So through the process of osmosis, it collects the water and nutrients from the ground. And as the next little box over talks about the four main functions of a root. Does anyone have anything that they, well, maybe because it's right here, but have any like thing that they want to offer about what they know about root functions? Hold down the tree. Yeah. Yeah. So like acting as a stabilization, like thinking about and looking above us at these massive trees. Like how does, like if there wasn't anything below the surface, how could this giant thing stay stable? So it's kind of just this unimaginable complexity and system that just blows my mind. Kind of just the very basic rudimentary 4 functions of roots are to anchor the organism to the ground and help with the stabilization, and to bring water and nutrients into the organism through the root cap and hairs from the ground. And like I said, water enters the root hairs through osmosis and then travels through the cells of the cortex until it reaches the vascular tissue and then up to the leaves, where the leaves photosynthesize. A lot of roots, like when we think about carrots and like the root vegetables that we eat, it's a lot of stored nutrients and sugars and starches. So roots also act as this large storage organism for the plant to maybe during the winter when there's not as much sun or it's hibernating, to still store that energy underground and as a reserve. Also, like underground kind of just act as like protection and help with produce vegetation as they grow in that way and up. So it's kind of mirrored in the ground as well as I went into this project, just like Googling roots, and it's just like, like thinking about how to enter and how to think about how to conceptualize this, because for me it's just such a vast idea and topic. I ran into just thinking about this idea of, or having to kind of teach myself and learn about the difference between like monocots and dicots, and which is something that I haven't studied very much plant biology in that way, that I found really interesting, and how there's kind of like different classifications. So the definition that I found, so a cotyledon is the seed leaves produced by the embryo. So in the seed there's either one cotyledon or 2 cotyledons, so like mono meaning 1 and di meaning 2. And they absorb nutrients packed the seed until it is able to produce the first leaves to begin photosynthesis. So it's kind of like, we think about a seed before it germinates or anything, it's a little like ball of potential. And so this is just for flowering plants, kind of in that world of organisms. And so monocots have all sorts of classifications and ways that you can identify them, but most plants that start with one cotyledon have a fibrous root system, which means that in that little picture right there, that it spreads out, kind of engaging with the soil, with maybe not as much depth, but kind of a similar amount of lateral and depth into the ground. And as we think about this, it's so complicated because in every ecosystem there's different soil and there's different potential for water and there's different environmental factors that affect the way that a plant grows. So if you think about the way a monocot would grow into the ground in like super dense soil versus the way it would grow if it was much more aerated and sandy. So this is kind of a false binary of one thing is this way and one thing is that way, if that makes sense. Cots, meaning 2 cotyledons, tend to have a taproot system, which, as in that picture, kind of sends like one deep shoot into the ground as more of a stabilizer, and then grows like other lateral roots and versions of fibrous roots off to the side. So it's interesting to think about like why a plant like what adaptations and benefits these different systems would have, having generally the same function for the plant, that there's kind of these two groups. And then there's trees and other non-flowering plants that have different versions. And kind of what I got from the research that I did is most trees start with a taproot. So if you think about the way a tree would need to stabilize itself, it's logical to think about it going deep into the ground to kind of get that initial stabilization so it can grow and be more sturdy in that, and then maybe branching out from there. Yeah, and so we clearly, does anyone want to offer like anything that they can think about of like ways that they've used roots, and just in this idea of thinking about the cultural side of roots and for like food, or is there anything that anyone can think of that they want to share? Yeah.
Yeah, roots for my family, half of my family is from Texas, and so we consider a lot of our roots there, even though myself and my sister have never actually lived there. I think it's a way to connect with family that doesn't live near you, but you still have a lot of values with, and you still have a lot of relationships with. You still have roots there, even though you might never have actually stayed there.
Root vegetables like carrots and
Yeah.
other various things that I like to eat and give people sustenance, especially in
Biggest ways that I bond with Damien is through foraging, and usually, especially in the wintertime, that's with root foraging, with fish root. And I really wish I could forage ginseng, but that's a different thing here. But dandelion root too is really good and has completely saved me from my allergies, so if anybody wants to talk about that.
Yeah, Sky.
Oh, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, so we can all probably, we've all probably eaten a carrot before. Is someone here allergic to carrots? Oh yeah, Dr. Hayes. I was like, so maybe not a carrot, but maybe they've eaten another root vegetable. Root potatoes. Yeah, does anyone else want it?
potatoes are tubers, right?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah,
What's that?
Yeah, so tuber, so like, yeah. So does anyone know or want to share what a rhizome is? Yeah.
Ginger grows in a rhizome,
Yeah.
and it's a horizontal. The stems grow out of it like this. So if you've ever seen like a big chunk of ginger,
Yeah.
or it looks a bulb. Rhizomes grow horizontally, and then the stems grow upward out of it.
Are they still roots if they're rhizomes?
Well, so my understanding is that a tuber is like an enlarged rhizome. I think
Is a rhizome a root?
it's kind of the area, like, so in sword ferns, like a sword fern grows from a rhizome. So like it's kind of the in between, like maybe sitting just above the ground or just below it, and so like the fronds would grow up from the rhizome and the roots would grow down. So it's kind of this intermediary. Is that other
Underground
folks
stem.
understand? What?
I think it's an underground stem.
Yeah.
like what it
Yeah.
So would you consider the interconnected roots of like an aspen grove to be rhizomes? Because those seem to run pretty laterally like that too.
They're described as growing rhizomatically.
Okay.
So they move laterally,
Right.
and they also have roots that go down.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and as we probably all have heard before of, that the big aspen grove is like one of the biggest organisms on this planet. So it's all connected underground, like perceived as just being individual trees, but there's this whole network underground that's connected. Yeah, so just thinking about at Gordon Carter and what we see around us, there's a lot of Doug fir and sword fern and red alder, So I decided to just kind of make thinking about this in terms of the place that we're actually at, exploring maybe the ways that the roots of Doug fir grow and sword fern and red alder. One thing that I found really interesting in my research was that conifers that grow like within climates that the topsoil freezes in the winter. The taproots usually go deep enough where they're able to access stored water deep in the soil, or maybe in a water table that's unfrozen. So it was interesting because I never really thought about that. Like, clearly there's not much growth in a forest if it's covered in snow, but thinking about if there's a bunch of frozen water, that may not be accessible to the plants. So it was cool to learn about that in the ways that through the seasons a plant changes its relationship with the environment in ways of getting nutrients. And yeah, we talked about sword fern and the rhizomes, and red alder is an interesting one, as some of y'all probably know about roots that are nitrogen fixers or have nodules on them that can fix atmospheric nitrogen into the ground, and so they're used a lot in as cover crops, as crops are grown and then depleted of nutrients that, like fava beans or other legumes are planted to return the nutrients back into the soil. So it's actually, this is something that I didn't know, it's not necessarily a part of the root, it's actually a symbiotic bacteria that is the nodule that fixes the nitrogen. But red alder is a nitrogen fixer. Yeah, I think I have that's kind of all I think I'll cover. There's more information on my info sheet. There's about 5 minutes for questions and comments. Thanks.
Can you tell us more about the symbiotic relationship between nodes and
Yeah. Anna is going to talk a lot about kind of the idea of symbiotic connections of roots through mycorrhizae, but I don't know if I can tell you more about it.
Branchiobacteria. That's the name of the bacteria that